What's going on, guys? Welcome to another video. My name is Milanmast. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to install a full cold air intake on your car. Now, the reason why I'm changing out my cold air intake now, after I've installed my aftermarket exhaust system, is because I want the engine to now get a little bit more power from an upgraded intake. So now that the exhaust system is no longer the bottleneck of the car, we're going to be changing the intake out. And I have a really cool product from Acuity. So in this box, I have Acuity's Curl Control Cold Air Intake System. And it's not only just a cold air intake, but it's also a battery relocate. Now, I'm going to be installing this entire kit on my 9th Gen today. So what you guys see here is the stock parts. This whole area of the car here is going to get changed up a little bit, and we're going to be able to get a little bit more power. We're going to be able to basically change the route of the intake system. Instead of it going back towards the side of the engine, it's actually going to come down here where the battery is located. Of course, I'm going to show you guys what's inside the box, but before I get into that, the cool thing about these Acuity cold air intake systems is that it doesn't matter if you guys have a stock manifold, a stock throttle body, an aftermarket throttle body, or an aftermarket manifold. They have a bunch of different variations of this same kit that will work for your car. Also, they've got other parts for 9th Gens in addition to other vehicles. But that's enough talking for now. I'm going to show you guys what's inside this box when you guys buy one. So everything that you guys see here on this table, from the velocity stack to the intake cone to all these little extra pieces here, all come included in this kit. Now, this one piece, this one coupler that you guys see right here is going to be the only piece that will differ if you guys were to buy a different version of this curl control intake. Now, let's say you guys are in the same position as me, where you guys have the stock throttle body along with the stock intake manifold. This is the kit that you'll want here. I'll have it linked in the description box. But if you do eventually want to, down the road, upgrade your intake manifold or your throttle body, this is the only piece that you'll need to buy, and they do offer them on their website. So this here is actually the upgraded piece or the different piece that you will need for a, let's say, ZDX throttle body with a different intake manifold. They have a couple different variations of this pipe. You guys can find that information in the description box. But as it stands for now, let me just quickly go over everything. So you have the intake coupler piece here. You have this really nice carbon fiber curl control carbon fiber composite piece. This has one fitting here along with the MAF fitting on the opposite side. You can see they're billet and they're purple. They're friggin' cute as hell, I'm not gonna lie. They come with the stainless gear clamps, both for all the couplers and also this hose here. You'll see this later. This guy here is for the coolant. We'll use that in a bit. Same with this. This here hooks up to the velocity stack, which connects to the cold air intake cone. You have two wires right here. These are really nice because these have factory clips on here, so you don't need to cut or extend anything. Everything you need is going to be in this kit. This little bracket that you see here will attach to the intake in this spot. You guys will see where this is going to be going after we remove the battery. Now, on the note of moving the battery, this battery tray base mounts over top of the driver's side engine mount, and it has everything labeled, and it's just a really nicely engineered kit, and I can't wait to show you guys how awesome this is to install on your 9th Gen Civic. Now, just like in the last video when it came to swapping out the downpipe and the catback, it wasn't just a matter of, just like literally taking, let's say, 5 bolts off and taking everything out and swapping it in. We had to remove the cowl, we had to get access to some other things underneath the car, and it's no different for this intake. We need to take off the front bumper. Now, relax, it's not that big of a deal, but let me show you how to get that entire process done. The front bumper needs to come off and the battery needs to be removed before we can install this intake. So in the meantime, sit back, enjoy the video. Let me show you how I'm going to install this. Let's get started. So before we can get started with swapping intakes, we need to remove the front bumper assembly along with this upper radiator cover. There's an assortment of clips and bolts fastening both pieces onto the front end of the car. Using a 5mm hex bit and a clip removal tool, we can take everything out. Using the wrench and 5mm, remove the 2 fasteners that thread into the radiator support. They look like this. Then, using the clip removal tool, remove all 8 plastic push clips. 4 of them will be secured onto the top part of the grille, and the other 4 will be secured onto the radiator support. With them all taken out, you can remove the upper radiator cover after you slide it off the hood release. Following that, we need to work a bit in the front wheel wells. Remove the 1 plastic push clip found right here. There was another one here, however I think my car rubbed it off since it rides much lower than stock. With both of them removed, you'll be able to pull the fender liner back just enough to expose this little opening. Using a Phillips head screwdriver, unscrew the fastener that is securing the side of the bumper up to the front fender. Moving down the bumper, remove the plastic push clip on each of the corners, and then remove all of the clips and bolts found in line with the backside of the bumper cover. There will be a 10mm bolt followed by 4 push clips and then another 10mm bolt. Don't forget the other clip at the other end of the bumper, and then we're done working underneath the car. Now this step isn't mandatory, but I definitely recommend it. Using some 3M tape, mask off the lower edge of the fenders and the headlights to prevent them from getting damaged during the removal and installation of the bumper. You can choose to also mask off the lower portion of the bumper so that when you remove it and put it on the ground, the paint won't get scuffed. Anyways, after grabbing the back side of the bumper and firmly pulling it away from the fender, you'll be able to release the 3 tabs that are securing it to the fender bracket. Once those are released, you can repeat the same thing with the bumper and the tabs holding the bumper onto the headlight bracket. Before you yank the bumper off the car, keep in mind if you have fog lights, they will each have a wire leading to them. Using the box that the Acuity intake kit comes in, that actually comes in handy for the step. Place it underneath the bumper to support the weight of it. Pull the front bumper forwards to give you a bit more room to access the wiring harness, and then disconnect the harness from the fog light. Once you complete that for both sides, you'll be able to remove the bumper from the car, obviously completing the bumper removal process. Now, if you notice when I took the bumper off the car, the lower headlight bracket has definitely seen some better days, and I was actually kind of surprised in the amount of rust that was on it. So, before moving forward with the intake install, I removed the headlights, stripped the steel brackets of their rust, and then painted them so they look like new. Much better. Moving on, we can begin by removing parts from the engine bay. First things first, the battery. Using a 10mm socket or wrench, loosen the negative battery terminal and remove its harness, then followed by the positive. On one of the J-hooks that secure the battery to the bracket, there will be a plastic ring that will come off when you pull it upwards on the battery wiring harness. Now you won't need it for the install, so you can simply set it aside. Then, with the same 10mm socket, loosen the 2 J-hook nuts that are securing the battery tie down. With the nuts backed off, you'll be able to unhook it from the battery tray base. There will be one on each side of the battery. You can then remove the tie down and J-hooks. Then, however you're able, remove the battery. It might be a bit tricky since there isn't any kind of handle or anything to help you remove it, and they also weigh close to 40 pounds, so just be cautious. Once you remove the battery, there will be a plastic tray above the battery bracket. It simply rests above it, and there's going to be 2 protrusions on the tray that fit into the base. Set it aside and just let the battery cables rest where they fall. Next up, we can get started with removing the factory intake system. Now, if you saw the video where I replaced all the fluids in my Civic, you would have a good idea how to get this done. Back off the tension from both worm gear clamps and disconnect the hard line leading to the valve cover. You can then remove the upper intake hose. Then, remove the lower intake hose that's leading to the airbox. Next up, the airbox has to come out. The upper portion of it has a mass airflow sensor, wiring harness, and green zip tie clip. Disconnect the wiring harness leading to the sensor, and then using some sort of needle nose pliers, remove the green zip tie clip from the airbox. Push down on both metal tabs, securing the upper and lower halves of the air intake box, and then remove the upper along with the intake filter. Using a 10mm socket and extension, remove the single bolt securing the front portion of the lower airbox to the chassis. Since I removed all of this not too long ago, removing the lower half won't be too difficult. When it comes to releasing the rear rubber bushings on the lower box from the metal bracket on the back of the engine bay, it can be difficult to remove. I greased mine about a month ago, and you can see that it came off very easily. Now, that's just a note to self if you guys are running a stock box. Following that, the coupler leading to the air intake resonator needs to be removed. There will be 2 10mm bolts that are fastening it to the battery tray base. Once you have them out, you can see the coupler is still attached at the other end of it in the fender area. But if you simply give the hose a tug, it will come free and you'll be able to slide it upwards into the engine bay and remove it. Now onto the rest of the intake that's found in the fender and bumper area. It's all gotta go. The first 10mm bolt secures the resonator chamber onto the chassis, and then there's going to be another one that's tucked in between the fender liner and the body. Using a long extension and 10mm socket, take it out. Once you disconnect the small breather tube from the resonator chamber, you'll be able to remove this big, bulky assembly. As for the breather tube, there is a single 10mm bolt to be removed at the front of the fender, and then the rest is secured by plastic push clips. You'll have to remove the plastic clips in the wheel well to allow the fender liner to drop down. Once you do that, it will give you enough clearance to remove the 2 plastic push clips, allowing you to remove the tube completely. You can then reinstall the fender liner along with a couple clips securing it. Now moving back into the engine bay, disconnect the battery voltage sensor, which is on the negative battery harness. Disconnect the clip that secures the two wires together, and then remove the battery ground bolt from the radiator support using a 10mm. The assembly should look like this once you have it removed. The battery voltage sensor has a plastic harness clamp that you can remove at this time. Now, you can remove it with a pick, but I found it to be rather difficult. You can also cut the clamp and then secure the wires later with a zip tie, and that will get the same job done. Go ahead and slide the plastic cover off of the ECU, and then remove the two 10mm bolts holding the entire thing in place. Now, before you can disconnect the brains of the engine from the main wiring harness, the main cable leading to the battery positive is clipped into the ECU bracket. Unclip it with your fingers or some needle nose pliers. Twist the assembly ever so slightly toward the back of the car, as it will allow you to unclip the three large connectors. Now, if your engine bay is a bit dirty, be sure to dust off any dirt from the connectors prior to disconnecting the harness, as you don't want any gunk to get trapped in there, which will give you a bad connection later. The ECU wiring harness connects to the ECU at the bottom by two small plastic tabs. Simply push them down and slide the wire off the bracket to release the ECU completely. Following that, we can remove the battery tray base. Using a 12mm and an extension, crack each one of the two upper bolts loose and then remove them. Located on the bottom side of the base, you'll be able to find an additional two 12mm bolts. Once you take them out, you'll be able to remove the entire thing from the engine bay. Next up, we need to reroute the wiring for the battery from this side of the upper radiator hose to the other. So to begin the process, disconnect the brown harness clamp from the metal bracket on the radiator support. After you slide it off, unclip the other wire on the main wiring harness from the wire on the rad support. The positive wire for the battery will not be routed in the factory orientation, so you can remove this brown clamp if you'd like. Since it won't be put to use, and I don't see myself putting the car back to stock, I don't need it. Now, still working on the power wire, remove some of the electrical tape holding the wire loom together, as we need to expose some more wire for this connector. You'll want to have about 6 to 8 inches of free wire before the connector, so it has enough room to be routed in the proper orientation. Once you have enough exposed wire, you can wrap the loom with some electrical tape so the wires inside can't get filled and saturated with dirt. It should look something like this when you're done. Now, the next step requires you to remove the upper radiator hose from the coolant outlet assembly. Now, there is coolant that is occupying the line, so if you take it off, a bunch of it will pour out, and it will keep pouring out until the coolant level in the engine is below the opening. So to prevent the loss of excess coolant, it's a good idea to remove a bit of the coolant from the radiator and drain it from the lower valve. The valve might be tricky to find on your car, but every radiator has some sort of drain. You can see on my Civic, the valve is made from plastic and is white in color, making it very easy to see against the black radiator. To remove it from the bottom side of the car, you may have to remove a plastic clip or two from the underbody trays. Now, you don't need to remove the trays completely. As you can see, there's a small drain hole built into the tray that allows the coolant to pass through. You also don't need to completely drain the cooling system, but I would say if you can evacuate half a liter or so, you'll be set. Since we have the battery tray removed, you can also get to the drain valve from the top of the car, which will be a bit nicer than getting underneath the car, as you can get potentially splashed by the draining coolant. If you remove the radiator cap, you'll be able to see it isn't filled to the brim with coolant anymore, which means we're good to go. Now, there still may be residual coolant in the lines, so place a towel or rag underneath the hose that we're going to disconnect. With some pliers, release the tension from the clamp and slide it down the hose. Then, give the hose a twist and remove it from the coolant outlet assembly. Be proactive and have the battery harness ready to be flipped onto the other side of the coolant hose, and then slide the hose back onto the fitting. Now, at this point, the front end should look like this. Bumper off, intake and battery off, and the battery harness rerouted. From the engine bay, it's quite clear to see that we removed a bunch of OEM parts. The factory airbox, factory intake resonator, a bunch of plastic couplers, along with the small breather tube. Of these parts, the only component that we're going to be transferring onto the new cold air intake system is the stock mass airflow sensor, along with its two mounting screws. Okay, now I almost forgot a very, very crucial step to all this. So before we get started with installing the intake on the car, you have to do two things. Smash the subscribe button and click the like button. Okay, now that you have that done, let's get back to it. Using a Phillips head screwdriver, remove the 2 screws that hold the MAF sensor into the upper intake box. Then, wiggle the sensor out of the housing and transfer it onto the Acuity carbon fiber intake tube. Because these parts are so small, do not over-torque the screws as you will damage them. You just need them snug into place. The sensor should look like this once you have it installed on the intake tube. The first part from the kit to install is not an actual intake part, but rather the new battery tray base. It is going to be relocated above the driver's side transmission mount. Before we can take out the 3 bolts that are securing the mount, we need to support the weight of the engine and the transmission. Using a jack, raise it and place it underneath the transmission until the weight of it is completely off of the upper mount. Then, remove all 3 of the 17mm bolts that are securing the transmission mount up to the chassis. They might require a good amount of torque to break them free, but they should be manageable. The battery relocate tray goes right over top of the mount. There's no customizing or trimming that needs to be done for it to install. The OEM bolts are more than long enough to accommodate for the extra thickness from the battery tray bracket. Tighten all 3 of these bolts incrementally until they're snug, and then break out your torque wrench and secure them all to 55 foot-pounds. As always, all the torque specs for the car are going to be found in the description box. With the new battery tray base installed, you can go underneath the car and remove the jack that is supporting the trans. The battery tray base is very well designed, as it comes nicely labeled. It has provisions for the MAF sensor, the battery voltage sensor wire, the battery ground, and it is a direct bolt-on. Moving on, the mass airflow wire has 2 harness clamps that should be removed as they will no longer be used. One will be found close to the connector, and then the other found on the plastic housing by the valve cover. Now, of the parts that came in the intake kit, grab the MAF sensor wire extension and connect the male end of it onto the side of the battery tray. Then, hook up the factory MAF connector onto the extension. As for the other end of the extension, don't worry about it for now. Next up, grab the negative battery harness along with the factory ground bolt and thread it into the back side of the battery tray. It is labeled on the tray where to install it should you get confused. Tighten it down and then set the terminal end aside for now. Grab the ECU and connect the ECU wiring harness onto its bottom bracket. Once you snap them into place, rotate the ECU and reconnect all 3 of the connectors. When you hear each one of them click, you'll know that they won't be able to back out. Once you have them all installed, position the ECU so that the lower mounting hole aligns with the new battery tray base and the upper hole aligns with the same factory location by the brake fluid reservoir. Tighten them by hand and then torque them to spec. You can then reinstall and secure the cover on top of the ECU. As far as mounting the battery, it's obviously going to be in a different location than stock. The bottom of the battery tray outlines the proper orientation of the terminals. Grab the battery and place it on the tray. Then, grab the battery tie down along with the J-hooks and secure the hooks into each of the openings on the new battery tray. Now, do not fully tighten the hardware at this point. The other wire that comes included in the kit is the battery voltage sensor extension. Hook it up to the connector by the terminal and then route it under the negative battery harness. You can then attach it to the connector on the factory wiring harness. Now, I don't have an aftermarket intake manifold or throttle body on my car, which means the upper radiator hose doesn't need to be adjusted. However, if you do need more clearance, you would simply unclamp both ends of the upper rad hose and then rotate the entire assembly clockwise. Just a tip if you guys are running into a fitment issue. The next step is going to be rerouting the coolant that is going to the throttle body along with the rubber line for the PCV system. This upper hose that comes down the engine and is the upper hose on the throttle body is the feed line, which makes the lower one the return line. Begin by removing the spring clamp at the valve cover and pull off the breather hose. Then, remove the small spring clamp on the coolant line coming out from the outlet assembly and wiggle it back and forth until you're able to remove it. Do the same thing for the hose leading to the throttle body assembly. The Acuity kit comes with worm gear clamps. However, I find transferring the OEM spring clamps to the new hoses a better long-term option. Transfer both of them onto the hose that comes included in the kit. Now, doing the next step in this order is crucial so you don't lose too much residual coolant. Move the clamp and remove the end of the hose from the throttle body coolant return, and then slide down the clamp on the other end of the hose. Then, put the new coolant hose on the upper nipple by the outlet assembly. Now, don't waste any time doing this step. Remove the lower hose completely and have the other hose ready to be put back on in its place. I was in so much of a rush that I didn't realize that I put the hose on the wrong side of the upper radiator hose. So when you guys are doing it, make sure that you put it on the side closest to the battery, but it still connects in these same two spots. The hose should instead be routed like this. You can now remove any rags you placed under the coolant lines since we won't be unhooking anymore. You can now place the negative battery terminal over top of the post, and then the same thing with a positive end. Ensure that the harnesses have a little bit of slack, and then tighten down the two 10mm nuts for each end. This part might not be necessary. However, you can see that when you reinstall the connector by the radiator, the wire will rub up against the upper radiator hose. Now, instead of leaving it like that, you can run some sort of braided sleeving on the wire to allow for a little bit of movement, which will ensure that the wire won't get damaged down the road. It is really cheap to buy, and it takes just a couple minutes to install. Simply split the sleeving at the opening and slide the wire inside of it. To replicate the OEM look, you can also wrap the ends in electrical tape. It should look nice and tidy, just like this. On the side of the battery tray base, the two wires that are running alongside it can be zip tied to the slot on the base. Tighten the zip tie and then trim the excess. Next up comes installing the upper intake support bracket and rubber vibration stud. Begin by threading the stud into the existing hole on the frame rail, where the one bolt for the battery tray base was fastened. Thread it into the chassis, but don't tighten anything else at this point as we need all of this to move. To assemble the intake system, we can begin with the furthermost part of it, the air filter and velocity stack. Push down on the velocity stack into the filter until the back side of it is flush with the bottom of the filter. Then, tighten down the worm gear clamp until it's snug. Following that, grab the carbon intake tube along with the silicone throttle body coupler. Before you attach the two, don't forget to place the hose clamp over top of the coupler because you won't be able to install it afterwards due to the bung on the PCV system protruding. Slightly tighten the clamp, but keep in mind that we'll most likely need to adjust it afterwards. When securing each of the silicone couplers, ensure the pipe and throttle body get seated right up to the ledge. That way, you won't run into any fitment problems. This is what the intake should look like with everything attached. However, you won't be able to install the intake like this. The velocity stack and intake cone needs to be installed after the intake pipe and couplers are installed. But you can see the air filter will be sucking in air from the driver fog light area. Slide the silicone elbow between the frame rail and down behind the headlight, and then position the other silicone coupler onto the throttle body. The gear clamp for the throttle body has a good amount of extra material when you tighten it, and it can be trimmed if you like. We can then fasten the bolt for the intake support bracket. Thread it in by hand, and then use a 4mm hex bit to tighten it into place. Then, secure the lock nut to the rubber mounting stud. Ensure that you have enough room between the intake and the frame rail so it doesn't rub and cause an issue later. Placing a small piece of foam sound insulation in between both pieces will prevent the piece from getting damaged. Now, insert the MAF wire extension into the MAF sensor. Working at the silicone intake hose, slide another gear clamp onto the coupler in addition to the velocity stack and intake cone. Try and position the clamp so it won't rub on the plastic fender liner and the paint on the chassis. If you have to reposition any of the clamps, couplers, or brackets, now is the time to do so. Lastly, the new PCV tube needs to be installed. The one end slides onto the valve cover and the other end onto the throttle body coupler. Push the included hose onto the hose barb and then install one of the clamps over top of it. As for the other end of it, you'll most likely have to do some trimming to make the hose shorter. You don't want any kinks or aggressive bends in the hose because the positive pressure from the cylinder head won't be able to be sucked into the intake system otherwise. Take off a little bit at a time because you won't be able to put any hose back on if you trim too much. This is what it should look like. With all the parts from the kit installed, the job is pretty much complete. The battery relocate should be installed above the transmission. The intake cone should be sucking air from the lower bumper area and curling the air into the throttle body. The fog lights and bumper still need to be reinstalled, along with topping up the coolant system, but that is it for the work that needs to be done under the hood. Since the intake piping is larger in diameter, we need to install a new calibration for the ECU to compensate for the additional air that is getting pulled into the combustion chamber. So using your Flash Pro or K-Tuner, install a new map so that the engine doesn't run lean. I wouldn't suggest driving your car without a revised tune. It's even more important if you're also running a different intake manifold and throttle body. Okay guys, so we're driving the car now. I've been driving it for the last 5-10 minutes now. No knocking, no misfires, no check engine light. everything sounds good, everything seems good, drives, you know, pretty good so far. Now this is not with a Pro tune, so if you guys are planning on staying with a cold air intake and full exhaust system, just like I have my Civic at right now, I would suggest getting a Pro tune because you're gonna be able to get more power, more reliability. You'll actually get a dyno figure so you'll know how much power the car is making, and you'll also get, you know, better reliability, better drivability, and also better fuel economy. So with that being said, how does it drive? Well, drives good. Sounds nice. No knocks. I've got my Honda app right here. It can tell me pretty much everything regarding the car. Let's drop a gear, maybe 2. Okay, I'll do 3. Okay, I would say it is definitely more powerful. Obviously it's not on the dyno, so I can't tell you 100%, but my butt dyno can confirm this is a little bit more peppy. With a Pro tune, you'll get even more power. So that's where you're gonna be able to actually extract the best bang for buck out of all your mods that you're putting on your car. As for the intake, it sounds good. Because of the location of it, I shouldn't in theory have any problems when it comes to actually driving in the rain or, you know, like very bad, you know, severe thunderstorms and all that stuff. Yeah, guys, it's a nice unit, I gotta say. I can't wait to throw more of their stuff on my car. All right, so I gotta show you this. The induction noise that this intake makes is sick, okay? Do a little roll from 20. It sounds so good when you rev this thing out. So between like 5,500 and 75, it's got a very distinct sound to it, and it sounds really good. I really like this thing. I feel like the longer that I'll own this thing, the more I'll appreciate it. And I gotta say, the one really nice thing about induction noise, like from a cold air intake, is that you don't have to deal with the droning and all that stuff. The only time you really hear it is when you put your foot to the floor and you rev it out. It's got a little bit like a growl to it. It sounds aggressive. I dig it. And look at this, still no knocks. Hell yeah. Now, for those of you that have been here on the channel for a while and you guys have, you know, followed me with my other Honda build, this car, I gotta say, is much nicer to live with and own and drive than my Accord. It's a smaller chassis, it's a tighter chassis, and I gotta say, throwing mods on this car doesn't really feel like wasted money. I love it. Guys, if you guys can find a 9th gen, I'm telling you, you guys will not regret it. I know of a couple people that own these things as dailies, and they say they're unreal. You get good fuel economy, they're small, they're fun, they come with an LSD. Like, guys, I wish I was like a salesperson back in like 2015 or whatever, back when they were selling these things, because you could make so much money selling these cars. They're so good, especially when you consider that the 10th gen and 11th gens are totally different than the 9th. I think this is gonna be the last of the NA SIs, unfortunately. So after putting on about 100 kilometers on this thing, I can tell you guys that you will not be disappointed. Now, the only really con that I can actually think of for this kit, the only shortcoming, is that the kit isn't free. Like, you have to pay for it with your own money. But, like, short from that, you guys will not be dissatisfied with this product. The intake gives you a lot more room to work on the front of the engine bay. It gives you access to things like the clutch, like the slave master cylinder, and a bunch of other things. It makes servicing the transmission easier when you have to do a dump and pump for the fluid. The battery is up top right here. It doesn't really change anything. But the good thing is that you get a ton of extra features like more power, better throttle response, more airflow all to the engine, and then you'll need a tune. So if you guys are looking to make a bunch more power, this is step 2. Step 1 is full exhaust. Step 2 is intake. Step 3 is gonna be manifold. And that's what we're gonna be doing next. If you guys wanna find any of the products you guys saw in this video, you guys can find everything in the description box down below. If you guys have any other questions regarding the video, comment section's down there. Don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you guys wanna see more of this kind of stuff. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.